we have two speakers for the program this evening. We have Michael Gue, who coordinates and oversees prescribed fire operations within Everglades and Biscayne National Park. Michael started his career in fire in 2000 in Montana, where he spent 16 years working on engine modules, hotshot crews, and helicopters traveling the country suppressing wildfires. In 2016, he accepted a job in Everglades National Park, where instead of suppressing wildfires, he found more flexibility to fulfill his dream of allowing fire to play a natural role within the fire-dependent ecosystems, which is, as we know, very important here in South Florida. Maya Tupaj oversees the Fire Effects Monitoring Program and coordinates environmental planning and compliance for fire management activities. Maya started working in the Everglades in 2006 in fire management as a field technician. Before that, she worked at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park in native plant restoration. So thank you both for being here this evening and for presenting, and I will let you take it away.
Perfect, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. I am going to, let me just switch over here to our slideshow. Thank you guys for having us. I really appreciate it. Being that we have about 22 people on tonight, it should be very easy to kind of make this presentation very interactive. If you guys have questions, please type it in the chat box or speak up and kind of answer those as we go along, or we'll also make time at the very end to answer some of your guys' questions. But we appreciate you guys having us. It's organizations like the Native Plant Society that kind of help, those collaborations kind of help keep the Everglades healthy and sustained. And we love coming out and chatting at events like this. I'm actually going to start by showing a little short video that we made for this in the last couple of weeks. Let me see if hopefully this comes across okay. All
right, yeah, but hopefully from where she's at this way, should burn real good.
I can't think of another land management agency in the country that can do what we do. The Everglades is such a dynamic environment, and the sheer size we get to implement fire in, it's really the only place that I can ever imagine working where I can go out and burn 30,000 acres in an afternoon. That's bigger than the size of Manhattan. We're restoring the natural flow of fire to an environment that's always needed it. Landscape burning, landscape implementation of prescribed fire, we can't do what we're doing anywhere else, not in this country. Planning that goes into what we're doing here in South Florida with prescribed fire, it's a lot of work. Everything from the planning stage to compliance to getting approval to the actual implementation of the prescribed fire on the ground. It takes a lot of really great people putting in a lot of hard work, and it's difficult at times. But to see the ecosystem in a healthier state, and to see the visitors that come in through those front gates of Everglades National Park enjoying that landscape in its more of its natural state and the beauty that it encompasses, it makes it all worth it. And it's probably the most powerful portion of what it is we do. very long time, we failed to recognize the importance that fire played to this environment. It's been in the last 70 years, we've come to understand that fire is just as important to the Everglades as the water that flows through it.
As was mentioned in the intro, my name is Michael Gue. I've worked for Everglades for the last almost 3.5–4 years as the prescribed fire manager. So essentially the prescribed fire operations that happen on the ground, I oversee that process.
And hello, I'm Maya Tupaj, fire ecologist for Everglades National Park. So I do a lot of our, run our fire effects monitoring program and also work on our planning and compliance and working with our partners in natural resources, things like that.
So like I said, we were pretty excited you guys invited us to come down and talk about the Everglades. And just, you know, we like to go around and have open discussions with different groups and hear what you guys are hearing out there, as well as kind of spread our message on prescribed fire and fire effects within Everglades, on just how important it is. As we know, the Everglades National Park is such a complex and dynamic ecosystem here in South Florida. It's got a lot of moving parts, and it's groups like yours that are a lot of fun to come talk to and get your guys' take on how you see things as well.
All right, so I'll start and give everyone kind of an overview of what we're looking at. In Everglades National Park, we are on the southernmost tip of Florida, adjacent to a major metropolitan area, which includes the Miami and the greater Miami area, a lot of places like that, which is home to about 2 million in Miami alone, about 6 million in the greater Miami area. And in Everglades National Park, we have about 1.5 million acres. So next to all of these people, we have this sort of large, vast wilderness. It's home to a number of different plant communities. We have about 9 distinct habitats, but the boundaries between them are always kind of changing and shifting. So it really is a very dynamic place. There are about 40 endangered or federally listed plant species that can occur in these ecosystems. So there is a lot of complexity within fire with what we're doing with the ecosystems. A lot of places have different needs. Some areas need fire, they depend on it. Other areas may be sensitive to fire, but all of the plants and animals within this ecosystem have evolved with fire or with the effects of fire in one way or another. And so then again, adding to the complexities of all that is that major metropolitan area. So in all of this, we kind of think about that as part of our fire story. So how we're managing fire, but also how we're communicating it to the people around us. So not only is our actual habitat within our boundary sort of complex and dynamic, but still even those surrounding communities make it even more complex, ever-changing, mostly seems like growing in the communities around us, but that's sort of the system we work in. And then looking within our park itself, so we have, like I said, we have 9 different ecosystems, 9 distinct habitats. Probably most well-known are maybe the wetland prairies or the river of grass or our extensive mangrove ecosystems. Also Florida Bay, for any fishermen who are on, don't want to forget all of you people. But those are some of the main ones that people think of when they think of the Everglades. But we have 4 main habitats we focus on. And we've broken those sort of into sections in the park. So we have our coastal prairies, that's along the west coast. Also in the sort of the middle of the park, we have our river of grass. And that has, that's a longer hydro period. That's the sawgrass, the term that, you know, iconic river of grass, that slow moving water that's coming like through these grass areas, generally what you would consider our wetlands. And then we also have East Everglades. which is another part of our wetland prairies, or the rocky glades. So they're not wet for quite as long, and it's also sectioned out. They are a little bit drier in an area of the park that was acquired just a little bit later than the rest. I think 89, if no one in this, not this room, this area, this meeting wants to quote me on that. And then we also have our pine rocklands, which are one of our smallest but most unique habitats. So we have all these different areas. These are our 4 fire adapted areas. And that's sort of just what makes all of this interesting. We work in Everglades National Park, but we don't necessarily work in the same spot. There's a lot of diversity within that. So in the coastal prairies, we do have these discrete pockets of grass that are intermingled with the mangroves on our west coast. The mangroves are very resistant to fire. So we'll have prairies burn, and as that fire kind of moves up into those mangroves, it'll just go out naturally on its own. There hasn't been a ton of direct human impact in our coastal prairies, not sort of the way we see in our more developed or immediately adjacent to developed areas. But one of the things we have going on in the coastal prairies is exotic invasive plants. So we have 2 that are kind of a big issue out there. We have Lygodium, or Old Word climbing fern, and also Brazilian pepper. So in our coastal prairies, we use fire to maintain a healthy ecosystem. We use it as a tool to directly manage the exotic plants in conjunction with other management actions that are based on the exotic plants, kind of an integrated pest management approach. But with fire, our goal is to reduce the amount of exotics present, so we can actually maybe kill a few individuals or reduce the amount, the biomass in terms of Lygodium. Individuals in a climbing sort of matting fern is hard to tell, but we can reduce just the amount that is up there. But the other thing we've seen that we can do with fire is sort of interrupt the reproduction. So when these plants are burned, they put a lot of their resources into regrowing, and therefore they don't have as much resources into making themselves reproductive, producing seed or spore that can then go somewhere else and create new populations. So that's sort of one of the things we're doing with prescribed fire in terms of ecosystem health in the coastal prairies. We're also, by burning areas where invasive plants haven't yet invaded, we're maintaining the health of those ecosystems. We're keeping them more resilient, which sort of means as a whole, hopefully that ecosystem itself, sort of the native plants, can be strong enough and prevent any exotic plants from coming in and taking over and sort of getting established. So that's sort of a brief overview of fire in the coastal prairies. Then we also have our other fire adapted habitat would be our wetlands. And we have, it's kind of the wetland prairie, the famous river of grass that I mentioned. So again, we have this very tall sawgrass prairie. Within these ecosystems, we'd have that deep water slough mixed with our marl prairies or our rocky glades. But all of that together kind of makes the vast wetland ecosystem that Everglades is really known for. And a lot of times when I talk to people about this, you guys are probably a little more knowledgeable, but a lot of people think, gee, that seems a little bit counterintuitive when we're talking about wetlands and water flow. How on earth does fire enter into that conversation? But really, these wetlands are one of our most fire adapted ecosystems. We like to say that our sawgrass is built to burn. So we have seen fire burning the tops of sawgrass immediately over standing water. That's just how flammable these places are, how adapted they are to fire. One of the roles that fire plays in the ecosystem itself is that it reduces the amount of the hardwood shrubs that are in these prairie ecosystems. So in this case, they might be native hardwood shrub species, but they're not a natural part of the prairie ecosystem, at least not in any high densities. The wetland prairies are, as an ecosystem, are of vital importance to a lot of our bird populations we have in Everglades. The iconic wading birds that we have endangered species that rely on these areas, like the snail kite and the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. So there's this delicate balance within the wetlands that provides this required diverse habitat for wildlife, but without fire and proper hydration throughout the Everglades, those hardwood shrubs can move in. And fire is a way to keep those densities at more natural levels. Again, they're native plants, but we want to keep that appropriate balance. Some hardwood shrub species, but mostly an open grass prairie, because that is what the species have evolved with, and that's what they're depending on. So in particular, this is of very much important for the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. It's an endangered species that exists almost entirely within the boundaries of Everglades National Park, and it makes its nests in the clumps of grass in the prairies, so it's a ground nester. And in order to ensure that its nests aren't predated by raptors and other things, they will not nest close to any sort of standing tall hardwood shrubs, because those make an excellent perch for a hawk, for example, can sit on that and look around and then see that unprotected nest and swoop in and take a bunch of tasty little babies, fledgling birds. So without fire, we see that increase in these hardwood shrubs that either prevents the sparrows from nesting, or if it does force them to nest in areas that are less ideal, it can increase the pressures on that, the nest success, the predating of those nests, losing those birds, which all can have a detrimental effect on any population, but especially a species that is so highly endangered. Any loss can be a very big deal. So that's sort of just an example of how fire maintains that balance in these ecosystems, even with native species. And so our last fire adapted ecosystem, because I lumped all our prairies together, is the pine rocklands. So this is one of the smallest in terms of spatial scales, one of the smallest ecosystems we have in the Everglades, but it is one of my favorites. I personally spend a lot of time there when I am working outside in the field. It's our ecosystem with the highest plant diversity of any habitat we have in the park, not just those fire adapted habitats. It has the highest plant diversity. And a lot of that diversity comes from a very diverse shrub or herbaceous and grass understory. So this could possibly be part of the reason I am out there for so long, because identifying all of those plants can take a very long time. Good for me that I like it out there. But another thing about the pine rocklands is it's globally imperiled. So it's sort of like this is an endangered habitat all unto itself. South Florida, Everglades National Park has the largest remaining intact piece of pine rocklands. Historically, it would have gone all the way up the Miami Rock Ridge. Now there's, I think, less than 15% in its entirety in South Florida. There are some pine rockland habitats in the Caribbean, the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos. But in terms of the United States, Everglades National Park has the largest, most intact place. And our pine rocklands are also another one of our fire adapted ecosystems. But this ecosystem, I would actually say, is more, a better description would be fire dependent, because we really need fire for this pine rockland ecosystem to stay the pine rockland ecosystem. So embedded within the pine rocklands, we have hardwood hammocks that are a natural area of slightly higher elevation, different tree species, and originally fire's natural role would be to burn through the pine rocklands when it sort of reaches the edges of these shadier, more moist hardwood hammocks. It would often go out naturally and then again maintain the balance between these two places. So also fire within the pine rocklands itself, it keeps that ecotone, we would call it, that place between the hammock and the pine rockland where they kind of intermix a little bit. It keeps it at sort of the line, so not one area doesn't move too far into the other. It also keeps the amount of hardwood shrubs within the pine rocklands themselves down, again with the hardwood shrubs. But they are native and they are part of this ecosystem. However, the diversity of the pine rocklands and even the pine seedlings themselves, that shrubby, grassy, or that herbaceous, grassy understory really needs a lot of sunlight. So the role fire plays is it will knock back that shrub layer. The shrubs will be top killed. All of the understory gets all of the sunlight and the water and everything grows. And then the hardwood shrubs will sprout up again. And then in approximately 3 to 7 years is what the natural fire return interval in a pine rockland would be. They would grow up and then again be top killed and allow all of those resources to then be focused on the understory again, specifically with the pine seedlings. So we would lose that herbaceous and grass understory, and eventually the pine seedlings that are in that layer would not be able to compete with the hardwood shrubs, and we would not have any new recruitment into the overstory. So even in about, it's very short, in about 10 to 20 years, you can really see that ecosystem change. And on the longer end, on the 20 years, you can see where you have really just lost a whole entire ecosystem. It's converted and succeeded into a totally new place. So, I mean, I mentioned that the pine rocklands are home to a number of endangered species. Some are very well known. Panthers really like to move in and out of our pine rocklands, hunting on the edge of the pine rockland and the prairie. They use the hardwood hammocks that are embedded in the pine rocklands for denning. So it's a very safe place for their dens. Then they can go out and explore, find a deer, hop it out into the open and have some room for hunting. We also have 2 endangered butterflies, the Bartstrom's hairstreak butterfly and the Florida leafwing. So again, the Florida leafwing is another one of those. As of right now, it only exists within the boundaries of Everglades National Park in our pine rocklands. So it's a particularly endangered species that we are charged with managing. But both these butterflies depend on pineland croton, which is a little sort of woody herb or a subshrub that the butterflies will lay their eggs on this species. This is the only host plant for the caterpillars, and it's the only plant they will lay their eggs on. So that is vital to their sort of continued existence. So that's sort of just an explanation. Without fire, we lose that diverse understory. We lose that area where croton, for example, grows. And without croton, then we would lose those 2 endangered native butterflies. And croton in particular, we do monitoring on a lot of different things. But one of the things that I mentioned we do fire effects monitoring is we look at both wildfires and prescribed fires to see what the effects of these fires are going to be. So part of what our monitoring is used for is we're able to look at these healthy fire adapted ecosystems. We know what we're looking for with prescribed fire, but it is a complex and a dynamic ecosystem. So we want to continue to use monitoring to ensure we are meeting the objectives that we set with prescribed fire for these ecosystems. We also want to monitor to see if anything else is happening in the ecosystem. We want to keep track of our successes, our restoration and maintaining healthy ecosystems. And we also want to make sure we're not seeing any unwanted or unexpected effects, either from fire, be it prescribed fire or wildfire, or environmental changes. So our monitoring is kind of a way that we can keep an eye, keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening in these ecosystems. And when we see something that maybe doesn't make sense, we can decide to take a closer look. So here's an example of monitoring and looking so closely at a pineland croton, again, why we spend so much time out there. But it's just those little things. So we see, you can see the burnt tree in the background in that regrowth. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to keep an eye on, so we can really know how important fire is in this ecosystem, and we just want to make sure we continue to use it in the best way for the habitat, the animals, everything in there. But also, not just for them, for the people as well, because like we said at the beginning, it's not just us. We are not an ecosystem on an island necessarily. And so all of this explaining the role of fire, sort of the natural role fire played, doesn't necessarily explain exactly why we need prescribed fire. People have brought up before, can we not just manage natural fires as they were managed before? But before European settlement, this whole area looked a lot different. One of the things that has happened is habitat fragmentation. So originally, we maybe would have a lightning strike that would occur and hit a pine tree or a dry tuft of grass that could start a fire. And then that fire could burn unimpeded until it hit mangrove, an area of water, more moist or shadier hardwood hammock, or it may burn until rains come and then sort of put the fire out wherever that may be. And being Florida, lightning capital, that would probably happen pretty often. But now we have fragmented these habitats. We have put up buildings, parking lots, roads, all sorts of things. So now, if we have a lightning strike, chances are it's not going to hit any natural fuels. And when it does, it may be right next to a school. So everyone needs to go and put that out immediately for the safety of the people. Even if it is in a preserved area, there are pineland fragments in Miami-Dade County, but they are surrounded by roads. So again, the fire would continue to burn until something stops it. So now that something, a lot of times, if a fire does start, is a hardtop road, a canal. Even in the more natural areas where there isn't development, there are a lot of canals that stop that natural flow of fire that we have seen. So in order for us to manage these ecosystems as close to natural as we can, we do have to implement active management, because the system is not natural anymore. We're not going to be able to go back there. We need to implement fire for the sake of these habitats. And that's sort of the ecological side of all of that.
So I take more of an operational approach when it comes to fire in the Everglades. And I like doing these talks with Maya because we get the ecology side, and then I can bring in the operational side of what we're doing with prescribed fire and kind of how we got here. And usually I don't take a lot of time during this section, but I like to take a step back a little bit and look at the history of what brought us to where we are right now with fire management, not only in Everglades National Park and here in South Florida, but across the country. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have watched the news and have seen just what we've been seeing across the world. Last year, we saw Australia wildfires, which were just unbelievable fire behavior. Previous to that, we've seen fires across the West, including the fires we saw in California that were extremely destructive. And I kind of like bringing all that because we're hearing a lot of noise in the world of fire management. I like kind of putting some context to a lot of that noise. And to do that, I like to just briefly talk about a timeline on how we got to where we are currently in fire management. And I go back to starting in 1905. We all know Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. When Theodore Roosevelt was elected president, he was the 26th president. I think it was late 1800s. One of his biggest accomplishments was preserving what now is a significant portion of our National Park Service lands and our USDA Forest Service lands, as well as BLM. He did the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which reserved over 230 million acres of public lands. If any of you guys have a chance to read about the Midnight Forest during his time, that's an awesome story, both politically and how he was able to accomplish what he did in this country when it came to conserving those lands. So we have Theodore Roosevelt, who put aside all the lands, which a lot of now are national parks. And right after that happened in 1910, we had one of the largest fire seasons that the United States had ever seen come through the west side of the country, Idaho, Montana, parts of Washington, and it burnt over 3 million acres that summer. And during that time, part of the reason we preserved a lot of this land was because of the timber. Timber at the time was a huge economic driver for the United States. And after 1910, we kind of started this, what I like to call the war on fire. This idea that fire is bad, fire needs to be stopped, and it puts at risk, what it is that the United States needs to survive economically. And so we start seeing this war on fire occurred. And that continued all the way through 1935 when policy implemented the 24-hour policy, which essentially was if I was a forest ranger in charge of a national forest in Colorado, and there's a lightning strike that causes a fire on a piece of ground, I essentially had 24 hours as a forest ranger to put that fire out. I could go down to the local bar, round up a bunch of firefighters, go out there and use the resources I needed to suppress that fire. And we were extremely successful at that within the federal government. Essentially 70 years, we put out over 98.9% of wildfires that started in the United States. We were able to suppress them year after year. And in 1944 was kind of the tipping point that really brought it to the public, which was Smokey the Bear. He was born, and we saw this campaign of only you can stop forest fires. We need to put fires out. They're at risk of destroying these animals' homes and these ecosystems. Everglades National Park was founded in 1947. And in 1958, we saw the scientist Bill Robertson. Throughout the 50s, scientist Bill Robertson was doing a lot of research on the pine rocklands and some of the animals that Maya just talked about, and some of the plants like the croton. And he started recognizing that we had a problem because of this policy suppressing fires. The Everglades grows so quickly, we kind of get a really good glimpse into what happens very fast, where, some places out west, it'll take, 70 years before you really start recognizing we have a problem. In the Everglades, it's a fire adapted ecosystem or a fire dependent ecosystem. In the pines, there's most ecosystems around the country are the exact same way. The difference is the Everglades, we get to see it up close and personal because the growth happens so fast. It's like watching it on a time lapse. And Bill Robertson started doing research and started recognizing, wow, we were losing the integrity of these ecosystems, primarily in the pine rocklands is where most of his study was happening. And with that research, he started convincing officials that we needed to make a change. So in 1958, Everglades National Park actually implemented the first approved prescribed fire right here in Everglades National Park. From 1958 till the year 2000, though, we didn't see a whole lot of change. We had the Yellowstone fires in 1988, which, even places out west started realizing, okay, we have a massive fuel loading on the ground. So we've got a lot of understory brush that has been building up, and they started recognizing it was a problem, but it really didn't change our policy. We were continually putting out fires. I started in 2000 in Montana, actually right near where this photo was taken in the Bitterroot National Forest. And in 2000, we had just a devastating wildfire season. Over 6.6 million acres burned that summer, and that was kind of a tipping point for Congress. They said, okay, we're spending millions upon millions of dollars, and it's not working. These fires are getting bigger, they're getting worse. So they decided to act. And at that point, they started funneling a lot of money into fuels management. Between 2000 and now, I like talking to some of the old timers in fire, because a lot of my bosses, they'll talk. The old timers would talk about, back in the day, a large, huge fire back in the day was 10,000 acres in some places out west, and we had this gap in time where we didn't see a whole lot of fires. Well, in the last 20 years, we've seen fire like we've seen in Australia last year, like we've seen across California and the West, right here, in the South, like Georgia. We've started seeing these fires every year that are just bigger, more impressive, costing a lot more money. And essentially every year in the last 20 years, we've blown some type of record out of the water, whether it's acres burned or money spent. But the fact is our fires are getting a lot bigger. And a lot of things you'll hear on the news is a little bit one-sided. In reality, it's a very gray issue that's very complex. One, we've got almost 100 years of fire suppression now, where we've been putting fires out in these fire-adapted ecosystems. Every one of these ecosystems, including right here in South Florida, need fire, and not only need fire to have that biodiversity continue, but to reduce that fuel loading. And when you take fire out, we're going to see that fuel loading of brush and woody material continue to grow, and that bulk density increase. So we've got a lot of fuel on the ground. The second issue is climate change. We're seeing hotter and drier and longer fire seasons than we have previously. And so you've got a combination of a lot of fuel on the ground with hotter, drier, longer season, which gives that fuel more time to dry out under more severe conditions, which is causing explosive fire behavior. And then the third portion of this is the urban sprawl. We're seeing communities that are building up in ecosystems that have always needed fire. And we're seeing it right here in Kendall, as we're seeing Miami expand right up against the Everglades boundary. We see it in the Chaparral Forest of California. Every one of those ecosystems that we see burning every year on the news are ecosystems that historically at some point had fire within them naturally. And so when you exclude that out, combine climate change, and you start putting people into those ecosystems, it's a perfect storm type of event that generates the situation we have across the country right now. So the question then comes to, what do we do about it? And one approach that we're doing in the Everglades, because we have done the research and we do recognize the importance of fire within these ecosystems, it kind of gives us a leg up on being able to sell that to the public and to be able to manage fire more proactively versus waiting for a reactive fire situation that is just completely out of our control. In the last 3 years, you can see I didn't go too far back, but you can kind of see the trend. Essentially, in the last 3 years in Everglades National Park, we are trying to bring the Everglades back in line with more the historic fire return intervals. So getting back to what historically happened naturally in the Everglades, like Maya talked about, in some of these ecosystems burning on a 3 to 5 or 3 to 7 year rotation. So with that, we began to implement more of a landscape level approach to prescribed fire. We've started working with a lot of our partners, and we're trying to take lines, jurisdictional lines off our map, and working with both the state as well as Big Cypress Preserve, and allowing fire to burn across those jurisdictional boundaries on a landscape level. And for the last 3 years, this will be year 4, we've essentially burnt almost 100,000 acres each year on average. This year we're sitting about 73,000 acres. But we're trying to use those appropriate weather conditions to implement a moderate severity fire, in a very mosaic approach across those boundaries and on a very landscape level, to bring that ecosystem back in line to the historical standards. Since we've started doing that the last few years, the results have really been amazing. You get out in the coastal prairies, we're seeing, we've seen a reduction of those exotic plant species that Maya talked about, like the Lygodium. We've seen mass colonies of birds. Last year, we saw for the first time in almost 40 years, we've seen mass colonies of birds move back into portions of the coastal prairies, and that's probably a contributing factor to both the increased water flow that we're seeing in parts of the Everglades, as well as we're seeing these birds foraging in places that we recently burned, and they're loving it. We're seeing a significant decrease in areas that we burnt with the cost of fire management. Essentially, we can burn in the Everglades for about $4.50 an acre versus what it costs for a wildfire to burn those same acres under natural or more severe conditions will cost oftentimes over $500 an acre. So we're saving a significant amount of money by taking a more proactive approach in these ecosystems that have always needed to burn. The wildlife, one of the stories I love telling is this actually happened about 3 months ago, right before we got into our really dry season. I was flying around. We were dropping balls out in the hole in the donut area, which is near the Nike missile base. And helicopter turned and looked down and goes, "Wait, is that a deer?" And sure enough, you could see this little deer moving out of the fire area. And out of nowhere, it was like watching National Geographic. We saw a Florida panther dive towards that deer. And went back and talked to the wildlife biologist. He said, "Oh yeah, that's very, very normal. Those, we're seeing, the Florida panthers, they love hunting right in front of the wildfires or the prescribed burns because it's chasing those animals out." And so we're getting to watch firsthand that ecosystem more in that natural state and how those animals are reacting within that. And I think the protection that we're seeing from wildfires to a lot of the communities right along the boundary, we're seeing a lot of the wildfires or the prescribed fire that we've implemented actually stopping multiple wildfires under more severe conditions. We had one 2 years ago that Osceola happened right around the Osceola camp, right around the Miccosukee Strip. We watched this wildfire start under awful conditions, hot, dry, and was running towards the community of Osceola, and it actually hit a prescribed fire that we'd implemented beforehand, and it had a substantial role in stopping that prescribed fire. So, with that, we're trying to continue to get that message out there of, kind of rolling back a lot of the propaganda that Smokey Bear has been putting out for the last 70 years, but taking an approach of more talking to people and the community. Luckily, you guys are so much more educated than a lot of other folks around the community, but using you guys as kind of a conduit to help spreading that message of what fire is helping us do to these fire adapted ecosystems and to the native plants here of South Florida.